Hello and welcome back to Faith Evolving. Today we're going to be looking at why purity culture is dangerous through the lens of the Netflix series Bridgerton. Since cringe culture is dead, I'm half tempted to do this entire video in my Julie Andrews impression. However, I feel like it's not super sustainable. Is this video just an excuse to talk about Bridgerton because my roommate and I just recently finished binging it? Yes, but this is my channel, so I'm gonna make it work. I'm gonna make it fit with the theme. So for those of you who don't know, Bridgerton is basically a London turn of the 19th century version of Gossip Girl. XOXO. Did I use that joke in my last video? Yes, thank you for catching it. It means you've been watching my videos. And if not, go watch it. Maybe subscribe and then come back to this one. So this video is going to have a fair bit of Bridgerton spoilers. So if you don't want this spoiled, add it to your watch later and then come back to it after you dedicate like 10 hours of your life to the show. Or if you don't care enough to commit that and you're fine with being spoiled, keep watching. But it was the kind thing to do to warn you. So besides Bridgerton just being a wonderful little soap opera situation, there's some really interesting commentary on purity culture that I found. Maybe it's just because I'm an academic's mind and I can't turn it off. I'm a film major. But a girl was analyzing it the entire time. So purity culture is this emphasis on your virginity and in a lot of times taking it insofar as it is where a lot of your worth is placed. And it's found in a lot of evangelical Christian circles. And even, I didn't really grow up super evangelical, but there were kind of whispers of purity culture. There was a bit of an undertone. So I personally can't really speak from being entrenched in that culture because I really wasn't. But I know that a lot of people have, and it's been very harmful to them. And even just like the effects of purity culture that I experienced has been pretty harmful for me. So it's pretty dangerous, and Bridgerton sure showed it. Now, it wouldn't be Faith Evolving if I didn't talk about faith. So we're gonna kick off the whole purity culture talk with its Christianity manifestation. So the purity culture movement as we know it today was a reaction to the 60s kind of sexual revolution and really took form in the 90s as a fear response to the HIV/AIDS pandemic that had been going on. And so there were these purity pledges, purity balls, purity rings. I'm looking at you, Jonas Brothers. I'm looking at you.
3 young boys wearing rings on their fingers. Everyone's like, are they married already?
Except for Frankie, our TikTok king. But this movement didn't come out of nowhere. There was still large emphasis on purity and virginity and gender norms and gender roles in the church a long time before. So for women, you were expected to be sweet and demure and pretty and poised, and your femininity was your crowning glory. The most glorious part. You think I wasn't gonna make another Julie Andrews reference? Please. So in your sweetness and your quietness, you could not be sexy until you were married, and then a switch is supposed to flip and you're supposed to be a sex goddess, gobble me, swallow me, completely comfortable in your sexuality, pleasing your husband. Because everyone's straight, apparently. And the men taking charge, leading their family, all this kind of stuff. A lot of the expectation resting on their shoulders. So they still were in a cage also. It was just gilded and larger, like they could move the cage. Whereas women were just like stationary in their cage. This metaphor is really running away from me, but I'm hoping that you get where my brain's going. Where it's chugga 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 chugga.
Oh, that's good.
And a lot of this harkens back to the temperance movement, which was really taking swing in the late 18th century, which we'll get back to. But it was this idea, it's not enough to not drink, you should also be abstinent. It's just this absolute purity. But it's important to understand the purity that's talked about in the Bible is really, really tied to the idea of cleanliness. And so you have to be clean to interact with the holy. And so one of the things that renders you unclean is bodily fluids, which is something that is a part of sex. You aren't sanitary, so you can't communicate with the divine, the pure, the holy, if you're unclean. However, we still have this mindset of sex rendering you unpure or unclean when most people in the American church or Western kind of ideas of Christianity have fairly readily access to baths baths and showers. But now the fun part, the part that you're probably here for. The Bridgerton manifestation of purity culture. So Bridgerton is set in the Regency era, which is also the same time period that Jane Austen wrote her novels. So think of this idea of romance, betrothal. I want to marry for love, but I often have to marry for other things. The exact span of time that constitutes the Regency era is somewhat contested, but generally it takes place at the turn of the 19th century into the early 19th century in the UK, which, if you remember, simultaneously in America, the temperance movement is really gaining steam. If you've seen Bridgerton, they often mention the season, which refers to the London season, when Parliament is in session. So all of the aristocrats and the nobles are in town, and they throw all these balls to entertain everyone while simultaneously providing opportunities for the upper class to mingle and possibly find a wife or a husband. And during this time period, especially amongst nobles, there were these really regimented societal customs that people had to follow. Really a mind your manners situation. If you don't, you're ruined, as is seen through Bridgerton's various courting narratives. Which is, unfortunately, but fortunately for me having a video idea, we encounter purity culture. So despite my repulsion towards binaries, we're going to be looking at the effects of purity culture on women and then on men. Non-binary friends, I see you and you're valid. Your existence to Regency era people would be like giving a Victorian child a sip of Bang energy, and there's power in that. So women and their value. Women were looked at as objects, and in many cases today still are. They had a severe lack of agency over what happened to them. If they had good people looking after them, they kind of had a little bit more say in the decisions being made. But when you really boil it down, marriage was bartered between the men, paying special attention to dowries, to titles, how certain things could advance them. It was more about getting the best deal than actually connection and love. This can be seen through Anthony just choosing that Daphne was going to have to marry Nigel despite her wishes, and the only way they got out of it was through basically being sneaky and finagling and gossip, and it really could have backfired. So women were basically just trained from birth how to find a good match. But as you're being bartered over, you could lose your value by this idea of damaged goods.
If I'd already known she was loose and damaged, not intact, I never would have talking.
But what makes you damaged goods? Sex. It's sex. And not just sex. Being alone with a man. Dare I say, kissing a man.
I said certified freak 7 days a week.
You are absolutely ruined. And so people had to rush into marriage to try to conceal these scandals of making out in a maze. Or in Marina's case, so she wasn't just out on the street, shuffled into unfavorable arrangements, tried to trick a man into marrying you, settling for just something, anything. There's this unnecessary desperation that women had to, and sometimes still have to face, which a lot of times was born out of ignorance. And it wasn't willful ignorance either. One of the things that I found the most interesting about the show was the severe lack of sex education and outright refusal to educate women on what sex was, and all of the adverse effects. So Eloise and Penelope have no idea what sex is. They are terrified that somehow they're going to get pregnant. And in Penelope's case, when she asks, how are babies made? There's a half answer at least. When Eloise asks, she's shut up. She's mocked. She's told to hush.
How does a lady come to be with child? Eloise, what a question.
I thought one needed to be married.
Whatever are you talking about?
Apparently it's not even a requirement.
Eloise, that is more than enough.
There's an outright refusal to just tell her basic biology. And then Daphne is left to find out from Simon in this half cringy, half steamy interaction.
When you're alone, you can touch yourself.
Duke of Hastings. Reel it in. And then after he tells her, he kind of recoils because he feels like he's corrupted her. And then when Daphne is about to get married and she asks her mother is so embarrassed she can't even tell her anything.
The marital act, which, now that you are married, you may perform.
If it is this difficult to discuss, how difficult must it be to perform?
Daphne goes into marriage without this crucial information, and it causes all of these problems in her marriage. In the next bit, there will be talk of sexual assaults. If you want to skip this part, I will put the timestamp in for you to skip to. Yeah. And then there's also no talk of consent, which leads to the marital rape scene, which then isn't ever discussed or processed, the trauma that's involved in it. And so there's all these emotional complications involved in such vulnerability that no one addresses because no one can even address the bodily processes that are happening, which is so reminiscent of abstinence-only education. How many marinas are out there because all of sex education is just mean girls or telling you that you're a dirty sponge now. Now on to the men and their freedom and the crazy double standards. We have this notion that reformed rakes make the best husbands. Violet, when you can't even tell your daughter what sex is, because men can rake around the continent, which I love that it's a rake instead of a hoe. How did we switch farming tools? Does anyone know? Leave it in the comments if you do. So unless if you're the eldest and you have more expectations, but even so, you can get away with a lot, Anthony. This is an Anthony Bridgerton hate club. It's often expected of the men to marry later, so they have their fun and then they settle down. Anthony, this can also be seen through Anthony's wonderful comment when Colin tries to marry Marina, that I should have taken you to more brothels, and you can't marry a woman you just met. But I can marry Daphne off to Nigel. Any queerness is not acceptable. You have to do it in the dark, as per Benedict's experiences. But really, you can go to your gentlemen's clubs, walk home alone at night, do whatever you want, travel the world, and then as a noble, you're good. You just vibe. Now, in modern purity culture, that isn't the case. Men are still expected to retain their purity and not kiss or have sex or anything of the sort. But they still have a lot more freedom in being able to go wherever they want, do whatever they want, have whatever job they want. Now, I'm hoping that if you watched Bridgerton, you learned that despite the sheer volume of sex scenes, purity culture and the lack of sexual education is dangerous and irresponsible, and we should maybe progress past 200 years ago. It's just a thought. Get back to me on it. If you like this video, absolutely smash that subscribe button. Leave down below in the comments how purity culture has maybe affected you poorly, or if you're like, I love it. There are some people who genuinely love it. I want to hear why. As always, fact check me, Bridgerton. Bye.